Okay, so let's look now at how the concept of equivalence works in translation. So we're talking here about the equivalence relation, or how can we understand the relation between translations and their source texts. So most lay people would understand any text as translatable. They would understand any word in English, for example, as having an equivalent in every other language, without really understanding the complexities that lie beneath language and culture. So there's this basic problem. Translations are assumed to be somehow the same as the original, but we all know that they're obviously different. So therefore, what does equivalence mean? Jacobson tells us that equivalence is unity in difference and sameness in difference. So this basically means that translations or target text and source text can still be the same or in some way united, but they will be inherently different because it's not possible to have equivalence at every level of a text being translated. Now, what happens when we have non-equivalence at word level? So let's think about what word level might mean. We might have sentence level, we might have text level, we might have culture level. So when we're talking about word level, we're really looking at morphemes and how they relate to other morphemes. So if there's no equivalence at word level in the target language, what do? We first think about what the nature of this non-equivalence is. So how could we describe this non-equivalence? And then, of course, as translators, we need to step away from the theory for a moment and ask, how could we solve this problem as translators? So these are really, really vital questions for translators to ask because, of course, we need to know what to do when a word doesn't exist in the target language, and we obviously need to translate that word. So this is how we can use equivalence theory to uncover how this might assist us in solving these problems when they arrive. So equivalence at work, we can take the example of Friday the 13th in English. It's described as an unlucky day in Anglophone cultures, but not necessarily in other cultures. If we're to translate this term, we need to know exactly what kind of information is required by the translation. So firstly, Friday the 13th, what does it mean? Okay, it's a day of bad luck. So auspicious people might avoid having meetings or weddings or important events on this particular day. So when we're translating it, we could use an equivalent in the target language, but it might not really work on that level of this cultural understanding, that it might not produce an equivalent day of bad luck. So do we have to then change the concept slightly in order for that meaning to be transferred across properly? However, there might be a context that we're asked to translate into which requires something different. Maybe we need to know that it was in fact a Friday for some reason, and this idea of it being Friday the 13th was not actually important. So if we're translating a legal document, for example, and so fired shots into such and such shop on Friday the 13th of May, that auspicious day aspect is obviously not so important in that translation, but it might be very important in, say, a literary text where this reference is being cited. Some other examples here, the colour of death, which is mostly black in the West and mostly white in the East. So you can see how the concept which might be used to translate the colour of death in some cultures would actually mean using a different colour, so using a different term. And a nodding head, of course, signals agreement in Western cultures, disagreement in others. We also have the example of the nodding head that way in Indian culture, for example, which of course expresses agreement, which is different to the way in which we, as a Westerner, would express agreement. So understanding these differences, and a lot of these differences are in fact cultural, are of course essential parts of translating. And this is why you often hear that translators need not only to be bilingual, but bicultural as well in their practice. We've recently had a new president-elect in the US, and there's been a lot obviously written about him, including a very interesting article on how to translate Trump. And I've picked out just one example which I found particularly interesting in this article, which I urge you to go and have a look at the whole thing. It's quite interesting in terms of also how we translate political discourse and moving from the political discourse of Obama to the political discourse of Trump. But this particular translator, who's translating from English into French, has picked out the term race, which is of course used a lot within political discourse in America. And she writes, for example, in American English you use the word race a lot. It's a word heavy with terrible historical significance for Americans. And she goes on to comment on how equivalents for race in French vary significantly. So it's also about asking what the context is of the translation that you're doing and what equivalent would therefore fit within that particular context. So consider how you might translate race in your language. Are there any issues that could be problematic, particularly translating this kind of terminology within a political context? So the concept of equivalence rests on this idea that the target text has the same value as the source text. And this is an understanding that Pym has particularly driven home. So sometimes we might have this equivalent value on the level of form. So we might be able to translate two words with two words, but we might not. We might have, for example, the word cheese again might go from one word cheese into two word cheese. There's still equivalence there. Reference, so for example with the Friday the 13th, Friday is always the day before Saturday, so that referential point might be important in translating across. Or it might rest on the function, and the function is a very important part of translation, and this is an aspect you'll be hearing more and more about as the semester progresses. But the function of bad luck on the 13th, which corresponds, for example, to Friday in the English, corresponds to a different day in Spanish. So equivalence theory doesn't tell us what value is to be supplied in each case, but it just says that equal value should be achieved on one level or another.